I spend most of my adult life observing how power actually works, not the way it's described in press releases or campaign slogans, but the way it moves quietly through institutions, agreements, and systems most people don't notice until something breaks. What we are seeing right now in the relationship between the United States and Canada is exactly that kind of breaking point. The sort historians later identify as the moment consequences became impossible to ignore, while Washington treated Canada as just another pressure point to be squeezed. Canada made a decision that struck directly at the infrastructure supporting the American economy. The effects are already rippling through factories, energy markets, construction sites, and corporate boardrooms in ways no amount of messaging can disguise. This is not a trade dispute that can be smoothed over with a tweet or a press conference. It is a collision between political recklessness and economic reality, and it is unfolding far faster than the administration anticipated. For more than 70 years, the United States and Canada built what is arguably the most deeply integrated production and trading relationship in the world, not out of sentiment or ideology, but because it made economic sense to treat North America as a single production ecosystem. Raw materials, components, and finished goods moved back and forth seamlessly, sometimes crossing the border multiple times before reaching consumers. When Canada was presented with an ultimatum no sovereign nation could accept without surrendering its economic independence, this moment was not triggered by a misunderstanding or a technical disagreement. It was driven by a demand, framed as final, that Canada restrict exports of critical materials unless American companies received preferential access at below-market prices. That demand was radical not because it addressed shortages or stability, but because it attempted to force another. The system worked precisely because it was dull, predictable, and governed by rules that did not shift with the temperament of whoever occupied the Oval Office. That assumption of predictability has been steadily dismantled over the past year as Donald Trump returned to power with a worldview that treats trade less as an ecosystem to manage and more as the battlefield where humiliation and dominance matter more than outcomes. That worldview finally collided with a hard limit country to sell its resources at a loss to satisfy a political narrative in Washington. Canadian officials immediately understood that compliance would not merely be damaging, it would be existential. It would establish a precedent that Canadian sovereignty could be overridden whenever an American president found pressure convenient. That was the line Canada refused to cross. What followed was not retaliation, in the dramatic sense people often imagine. There were no sweeping tariffs or fiery speeches about revenge. Instead, Canada took a far more consequential step. It withdrew from voluntary supply chain coordination arrangements that function only when both sides trust each other to act rationally. In doing so, it revealed just how fragile the American production model has become after decades of just-in-time manufacturing that assumes parts will always arrive on schedule and never plans for what happens when trust evaporates. Within hours of the announcement, the effects began cascading. Automotive plants in Michigan and Ohio received notices that shipments were being delayed indefinitely. Not canceled, not banned, simply delayed in ways that destroy production schedules, because in a just-in-time system, a delay of days is effectively a shutdown. Construction firms discovered that Canadian steel and lumber were no longer clearing the border on the timelines there. Contracts assumed, energy markets reacted immediately. Guaranteed minimum flows of Canadian oil and natural gas were no longer guaranteed, injecting uncertainty into pricing models that depend on stability above all else. This is where the administration's core misunderstanding becomes clear. Size does not equal leverage in an integrated supply chain. The country that controls critical inputs at key choke points often holds more practical power than the final consumer market. Canada sits precisely at those choke points for energy, minerals, automotive components, and construction materials that American industries cannot quickly replace. Not in weeks, not in months, and in some cases not without massive capital investment that takes years, yet the ultimatum was issued as though Canada had no real choice, as if GDP asymmetry alone guaranteed submission, ignoring the reality that modern manufacturing is a fragile choreography where one missing part can idle an entire facility. As disruption spread, something unusual began happening in corporate America. Executives who had remained silent during earlier trade threats started making frantic calls to Congress and the White House, not to debate ideology, but to explain operational facts. Factories would shut within days, workers would be furloughed, and competitors in Europe and Asia, unaffected by this chaos, would permanently seize market. Share these warnings were not theoretical. They were backed by data, inventory counts, and timelines that exposed how little margin for error exists in the current system. The Chamber of Commerce issued emergency statements. Manufacturing associations released projections showing hundreds of thousands of jobs at risk within weeks. Suddenly, the consequences of treating trade policy as performance art became impossible to ignore. When a factory stops, no narrative restarts it. When a worker is sent home, no slogan pays the bills. When energy prices spike because supply certainty vanishes, consumers feel it immediately. What makes this moment particularly dangerous is that it follows a familiar pattern: threats issued without an exit strategy. Tariffs on China ended with American farmers needing bailouts. Border threats against Mexico nearly shut down supply lines before business pressure forced a retreat. Canada is different. The integration is deeper, the reliance more absolute, and the political will to submit simply does not exist. That combination creates a crisis that cannot be managed with bluster. As economic harm became unavoidable, fractures appeared inside the administration's own coalition. Republican senators from affected states demanded resolution. Labor unions warned of imminent layoffs. Business leaders who once praised toughness began distancing themselves, not out of newfound principle, but because their balance sheets were bleeding. This is the moment when the spectacle of strength collides with the substance of governance. Dominance that produces collapse is not strength, it is failure. The deeper problem, and the one that will outlast the immediate disruption, is the signal Canada sent to every American ally, watching closely. Economic integration with the United States now carries political risk that cannot be neutralized through normal diplomacy. Once that lesson is learned, it does not unlearn itself. Companies adapt, governments diversify, supply chains reroute, not depend on American reliability. Because reliability is the true currency of power, and it is being squandered in real time. This is not simply a standoff between two governments. It is the exposure of a structural vulnerability that's always existed but was never tested at this scale. An economy that assumed cooperation would persist even as it elected leaders who openly scorned that cooperation. The consequences of that contradiction are now arriving faster than anyone planned, reshaping incentives, alliances, and calculations across North America in ways that will not be easily reversed. Once trust is replaced with contingency planning, the old system never fully returns. What makes this moment so destabilizing for Washington is that there is no clean exit, no graceful reversal without acknowledging failure. The entire strategy rested on the assumption that Canada would blink. When that assumption collapsed, it exposed how little contingency planning existed behind the bravado, trapping the administration between escalation and retreat, both carrying real political costs that can no longer be hidden. If escalation continues through comprehensive tariffs, supply chain damage accelerates. Factories already teetering shut entirely, layoffs spread from the industrial Midwest into energy and construction. Prices rise. The claim that this is merely a negotiating tactic collapses under lived experience. Americans notice when plants close, projects stall, and costs climb. Those realities cannot be explained away at rallies. If de-escalation follows, the reckoning is different but no less severe. A political identity built on never backing down cannot easily accommodate compromise. Any concession will be framed as proof that the strongman posture failed when confronted by a sovereign nation willing to absorb short-term pain to protect long-term independence. That damage extends beyond economics into institutional credibility as allies judge outcomes rather than rhetoric. Inside Washington, scrutiny is intensifying. Trade experts who warned against this path are being vindicated. Lawmakers scramble to distance themselves from policies they did not design but must now defend. The constitutional imbalance that allows a single executive to unleash massive economic disruption before meaningful checks can occur is being examined more closely than it has been in decades. Because courts move slowly, Congress is paralyzed. And the consequences are immediate. What Canada did, intentionally or not, was force the conflict into the real economy, where ideology matters far less than logistics. Trucks stuck at borders do not respond to messaging. Energy flows ignore rhetoric. Manufacturing lines do not pause politely while craft narratives are recalibrated. The most lasting effect may come later, quietly, as American firms redesign supply chains to reduce exposure to political volatility. Components will be sourced elsewhere, even at higher cost. Redundancy will replace efficiency. Investment will shift toward jurisdictions where predictability still exists. Once those decisions are made, they rarely reverse. An integrated North American economy built over generations begins to fragment not with a dramatic collapse, but with thousands of quiet recalculations. Canada understands this dynamic, which is why it is accelerating diversification, deepening ties with Europe and Asia, and ensuring no future American ultimatum carries the same systemic threat. The lesson is practical, not theoretical. Dependence on a partner who treats interdependence as leverage is itself a vulnerability. American allies are drawing the same conclusion. If the United States is willing to issue ultimatums to its closest neighbor, a country with shared language, values, and the longest peaceful border in history, no ally can assume immunity. That realization will shape diplomatic and economic strategies for years. None of this was inevitable. Supply chains did not fail because of natural disaster or unavoidable crisis. They failed because political theater was elevated above institutional stewardship, because complexity was mistaken for weakness, and because dominance was pursued without regard for the systems that sustain prosperity and security. The costs are being paid by workers sent home from idled plants, small businesses without materials, families facing higher energy bills, and communities watching decades of integration unravel through no fault of their own. That disconnect between decision makers and those who bear the cost is what makes this crisis so corrosive to democratic accountability. When power can inflict harm without immediate consequence, trust erodes not only internationally, but at home as events continue to unfold. The central question is not whether the United States can force Canada back to the table, but whether it can relearn the discipline required to wield power responsibly in a world where leverage cuts both ways. Strength without restraint becomes self-sabotage. Unpredictability disguised as toughness drives partners away. Canada's refusal exposed that reality with unusual clarity, demonstrating that sovereignty still matters, trust is finite, and even the largest economies cannot bully their way through systems they themselves helped create. Once that truth becomes visible, it does not vanish when headlines change.